Hi, this is Robert Hewitt Wolfe, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
My name is Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, episode 98 for May 11th, 2020. Well, I'm going to read a few titles to you. Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Andromeda, The 4400, Alphas, Elementary. What do these have in common other than being some of the greatest sci-fi shows? Robert Hewitt Wolfe, and that's who I'm interviewing today. He is an executive producer. He helped develop Andromeda, as well as the Dresden Files, and he's just a very accomplished writer, and you're going to love his interview, which is coming up in just a second. This episode is sponsored by Pilar Alessandra. You may know Pilar Alessandra as the author of the Coffee Break Screenwriter and host of the On the Page podcast. She asked me to offer you 10% off of her interactive online class, Rewrite Techniques, running 4 Saturdays, May 23rd to June 13th. In the first 3 classes, Pilar helps you sort through the development and rewrite possibilities of your film or TV script by focusing on one element at a time: a story pass, character pass, dialogue pass, etc. Class 4 is all about the business, and here career coach Lee Jessup takes over, talking to you about the current state of the industry and answering your questions about getting representation and finding work as a writer. The class is open to screenwriters and filmmakers at all levels and is taught through Zoom conference in real time. A completed first draft is not required. To get your 10% off, use the coupon code ONTHEPAGE10 at checkout. Speaking about sponsoring, there's a new way that you can support the podcast. There are a lot of operational costs like hosting, web serving. You can visit tvwriterpodcast.com/support to find out how you can become a patron of the podcast for as little as 25 cents per episode. Check it out, tvwriterpodcast.com/support. On to my interview with Robert Hewitt Wolfe. You're going to love it. Enjoy. Well, I'm so excited to welcome veteran writer Robert Hewitt Wolfe, who has written on and produced such shows as Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, Andromeda, The Dresden Files, Elementary, and a whole bunch in between. Welcome, Robert.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
I'm so happy that you could join us. I actually happen to be a fan of a lot of those shows, and actually, the fact that the freelance script that sort of got you in is an episode that I remember. Which is not something I can always say with writers that I interview. Why don't you start there? Tell me about back in the Next Generation days when you could actually submit freelance scripts, what that was like.
Well, so back in the day, Star Trek Next Generation and subsequently Deep Space Nine and Voyager had a pretty much open door policy when it came to writers submitting to the show. And there were a lot of ways you could submit to the show. One of the most famous is that you could submit an episode, a spec episode of the show itself. So you could write a spec Next Generation, sign a waiver, and send it in, and they would read it. Readers would read it. It would get through the skim pile, and then if it was good enough, one of the writers of the show may indeed read it and either invite you into pitch, which was the most usual path if they liked it, or a very rare occasion they would buy either the script itself or the underlying idea and story of the script. And that's, for example, how Ron Moore and Renee Echevarria both came into Next Generation. I didn't come in through that route. Mm-hmm. They also would accept pitches from established writers or more or less established writers that had agents. And since I had gone to film school at UCLA and I placed well in a contest, I actually had an agent.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, and I had come very close to selling like a big sci-fi feature. So my agent at the time represented Joe Manosky on Next Generation and just got me into pitch based on the strength of the sci-fi feature that I had come close to selling. And I pitched them a couple of things. The first time I came in, didn't sell anything. They invited me back, though, so I must have impressed them at least on some level. Pitched another couple of things, didn't sell any of those. And then I got invited back for the third, and what I was sure was probably the final time. And I had 2 ideas, and one of them I was sure was going to be a sale, and I pitched it all out. And it was a time travel episode, and they said, "Oh, we love it, but we have something kind of like it on stage right now." Mm-hmm. Oh well, that sucks. And I was very frustrated. But then I rolled into the next one, which was not as well developed, which was Fistful of Datas, and they bought it. They loved it. And based again on the strength of my feature, they let me write the first draft of the script. Based on the strength of that, they had me write a freelance Star Trek Deep Space Nine. They had a story for Keyless, but they didn't have a script, and they needed a writer for it. So they had me write that, and based on that, they hired me on to Deep Space Nine. So that's basically how I got started.
Very cool.
Started.
Tell me a little bit about. So you wrote a sci-fi feature. Was your thought that you wanted to write features, or did you want to write for TV, or what was sort of your desire at that point?
Well, back in the day, I wanted to write features, but that was partially based on the training in school back then. UCLA, where I went to school and got my bachelor's and my master's in film, their writing program at the time was very heavily focused on feature writing. And so, although I did write an episode of the in-house produced sitcom that we did at UCLA, all the rest of my writing was spec features. And so probably 8 or 10 of them by the time I got the job, and a couple of them had come very close to selling. One of them, the science fiction one that I used as my sample, I did sell a couple of times. And
oh, you did?
It almost got made once. That's the story of my career. I've sold several features, and none of them got made. I've come perilously close on 3 or 4 of them. So that's just the way it goes. And the feature business is a tough business. Anyway, so very quickly, at a time when almost all the writers in town were focused on features, I realized, hey, television, like they make these, they produce these, you get paid, and they get on the air. Like, in the time it took to try to negotiate a deal for the feature that I was trying to sell, and the whole thing fell apart. I sold and wrote Fistful of Datas, and it was on the air shortly thereafter. And so I just realized pretty quickly that if you want to get produced, TV was the place to be. And I think I was a little ahead of the game then, which was fortunate for me. So
very cool. And that led, because that was pretty late in Next Generation. Did you actually work on Next Generation, or did you go right?
No, I only wrote the one freelance. Script, and then they hired me very quickly onto Deep Space Nine as a staff writer. So I was at Deep Space Nine before the show came on the air. I think I think I sold Fistful of Datas towards the end of season 4 of Next Generation, and I think it aired season 5. Yeah, and was produced and aired in season 5. And then season 5 was when they were launching Deep Space Nine. So in the middle of season 5 of Next Generation, I believe, is when Deep Space Nine came on the air. Is that right? Maybe add a year to that. I'm a little fuzzy on the exact whether that was season 5 or 6, but yeah.
So talk about being on DS9 from the beginning. What was that like? That was your sort of baby staff writing experience?
Yeah. That was really my education in television writing. I mean, I was working for amazing veteran writers. I mean, Michael Pillar was a terrific writer. He created Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and he was really one of the main forces behind turning Next Generation around when it was in trouble in the beginning. And so he was terrific. He gave a lot of writers their first job in Hollywood. Me, Ron Moore, Brandon Bragan, Shankar, Renee. I mean, he just was great at discovering new talent and giving them their first shot. And then Ira Bear was, my principal mentor. He took over running the show after like the first year and a half. And I just learned a ton from him. Peter Allen Fields, who was this pro who'd worked on like Have Gun Will Travel, I think, or Man from
Wow.
So I learned a lot from him too. And it was just a great environment. And then eventually Ron and Renee came over. It was great working with them too, and Hans. And it was just a great group of people. I'm focusing mostly on the writing room, but obviously we had a great cast. And it was also just like, we did 26 episodes a year and there were 5 people on staff. So most of the time. So I co-wrote 37 of them, I think, over the course of 5 years. And that's just like, I don't get to do that now as a staff writer.
No.
But as a staff writer right now, and even as a story editor, you're lucky to write 1-2 scripts a year, and I was writing or co-writing a lot of times with Ira, like 6, 7, 8 a year.
Wow.
And so that's just a huge education. I mean, that's the sort of like, that's where you get your Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours pretty fast, So that was a great benefit. And also another great benefit was that we had such terrific actors and production people, bringing that stuff to life. And so you just sort of really got a really good idea, or I got a really good idea very quickly of sort of what was working, what wasn't, how to write to the strength of actors, how to write stuff that could be done by production. Because we had a terrific production crew, but of course they couldn't do everything. And so there were things they just could not do. And if you couldn't do it on Deep Space Nine, you probably couldn't do it at all until now when you can spend $15 million on an episode of television. But in the day, so that helped a lot, just learning sort of the nuts and bolts of television writing and producing. It's just a great group of people. It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of stories about those Star Trek rooms. They're just kind of different than other shows. Is that true? I mean, some of the names you mentioned are like these big names now, and they were all kind of in the room together.
I mean, I think, in retrospect, it was sort of a murderer's row of talent, but I think, the principal difference I think now is that the rooms were smaller. We moved very fast. And we sort of had a lot of confidence in what we were trying to do, I suppose. And it was just, whatever, with the five of us, whoever it was, but let's say it was me and Ira and Renee and Ron and Hans working together. We could break a story in like 2 days, just a couple afternoons, 3 days. And we didn't break them in as much detail as they do now, just by merit of the fact that we had to break so fast. It was just like, I don't know. It was just like one of those. It was like a basketball team where everybody knows what they're doing, and you got confidence when you pass the ball. Something good's going to happen. So, it was a pleasure. Wow. I don't know that it's that different from a writing room, except that it's smaller and we worked a little faster. I don't know that it's radically different from a lot of rooms that are out there right now. And I know there have been other, great rooms. There's lots of great rooms out there. I just happened to sort of luck into being in a terrific one right from the start.
Wow. Very cool. And you were on the whole run?
I was on for the first 5 seasons. I got a little burned out. You imagine like 5 years of 26 episodes and that kind of workload. Yeah. And I also, I was sort of at a point where, I had been promoted up the chain the whole time. So I was a producer, I think, at season 5. Everyone above me had gotten promoted too. And so I'd never been able to like supervise another writer. Like I was still like the lowest ranking guy on the show. So I think I was sort of yearning to try to figure out how to run a show myself and all that other kind of stuff. And I had that feature had finally sold. It was looking like it was going to get made. And so I actually left to do some work on that and do some work on some other stuff. Maybe it was a bad decision. Maybe it wasn't. But at the time I was pretty burnt. So,
yeah. But then you ended up coming back and talk about developing Andromeda. How did that happen?
Andromeda, honestly, I think they approached Renee first, and Renee said, you should talk to Robert about this. And so they had Kevin Sorbo, and they had the rights to mine whatever material they wanted from like Gene Roddenberry's pile of unproduced notes and scripts, but they didn't really have much more than that. And they were developing 2 different tracks. One was sort of a planet-bound show, sort of more like New Genesis in a lot of ways. And then they also wanted a Starship show based on the same sort of material. And so they paid me and another writer to each develop one of those 2 ideas. And so I got the Spaceship show, which is great. That's the one I wanted. I probably wouldn't have wanted to do the other one.
Yeah.
And they liked my take better, I guess, although they liked their title better. So theirs was called Andromeda. Mine was called Phoenix Rising. And so they said, can you retitle it Andromeda? And I was like, yeah, I guess so. I'll just change the name of the ship. Yeah. So that's what I did. And so it was a great experience. I wrote the Bible. I wrote a Bible and a proposal, and off the strength of that, they sold the show for 44 episodes before I'd even written a script, I think.
Wow.
It's crazy. And then I wrote the first 2 scripts. They liked them a lot. We got the production up and running. The biggest issue with Andromeda was that we just had no money. And one of the problems with the show was that, they what I pitched and what they wanted was just enormous in scope, aliens and robots and action sequences and starship battles and all that stuff. And then when I finally started producing the show, I realized they couldn't afford any of it. Like they really couldn't afford. They could barely afford our sets. They couldn't afford costumes, really. Set dressing. I mean, so we had a really great crew, and they did their very, very best with the very limited resources we had. But that was always the biggest problem in Andromeda was like, and when I talked to them about doing stuff like, let's do less action and less starship battles and less aliens, they were like, no, we want all that. Well, yeah, you want it all, but you're not paying for any of it. So it's going to look like shit, right?
Yeah.
Which it kind of did, unfortunately. But yeah, I think it's still, we got 110 episodes out of it, and it's still out there, and people still seem to be enjoying it. So that's cool.
And so a couple seasons in, there was a bit of a hiccup. Tell me about that experience.
Yeah, there was a bit of a hiccup. They didn't like me telling them that they couldn't afford what they wanted, for one thing. I think at the end of the day, there were a couple issues. I think one was which was I was trying to convince a company. Tribune was a company that was in the newspaper business. And so a newspaper has no residual value. You make a newspaper, you distribute it, and the next day it's used to wrap fish, right? And so to try to make them understand residual value for a television show, I don't think they ever really understood it. So when I'm pushing them to say like, hey, if you spent $500,000 more an episode, you would make a lot more money on this. That was just not in their business model. They just didn't really understand that. And then I think I was leaning towards a more serialized show, probably a more Roddenberry-esque show that was more complicated and thematic. They wanted something very simple that they could sell overseas. They literally told me at one point to dumb down the show. Like usually when people say that, they don't use those exact words.
Yeah.
But they were like, hey, can you dumb the show down? I'm like, I guess, sure. But one of the other things I also realized eventually was that in my contract, I had a big kicker if I got to season 3. And so it was in their financial best interest to get rid of me. So they sort of manufactured a crisis and they fired me. Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah. It sucked. I mean, it was tough. It was a tough gig. But I'm proud of what we did and the limited resources we had, and I'm proud of the writers that I worked with, and I helped. I launched the careers of a few writers on that show too. Stenson Miller, who wrote X-Men First Class and the first draft, and Thor, and Derek Hughes, who was just finished I think he was a co-EP on the last season of Arrow, but he's had a really nice career.
Yeah, he's on actually now.
And I actually gave Eric Olson his first produced credit on Andromeda, and he did like the 3rd season of Daredevil and Man from High Castle. So, I think I managed to find some good people too on that show. So I tried to pay forward what Mike had done for me.
Yeah. Well, and it's just part of the business. I know so many shows have. I mean, I think the original Battlestar Galactica. The crazy stuff the network wanted, they put it on Sunday night, and they had to make all this educational content in it. Greatest American Hero. I mean, they tell horror stories about the 3rd season, and they just made it a comic book practically. It's just, you hear so many stories about how the network just asks for stuff that you can't as a writer deliver.
Yeah, like it's weird because I've subsequently met like almost everyone who was involved in getting rid of me, and all of them said it was a huge mistake, and it was one of those things where none of them want to claim credit to the knife, Yeah. But so that's nice. It's nice for like everyone to say like, oh, the show really, we made a big mistake getting rid of you. But whatever. It was painful at the time, but I've been fine. I've subsequently been just fine, so it's all good.
Well, so talk about that. So at that point, you've left that show. What was the landscape like? Like you'd worked a few years inside one sort of ecosystem, and then you did this show, and then now what?
Well, I actually went back to features for a while, which is why I don't have a lot. I have very spotty credits. There was a giant Hans Beimler from Deep Space Nine wrote this giant epic about the conquest of Mexico that we worked on for a year and a half, and it looked like it was going to get made at one point. Ron Howard was attached to direct, and they went so far as to do a soft prep on it, and then Ron went off to do Cinderella Man, and I think right after that he went to do Da Vinci Code, and we just, that was, it's tough to, like, if you can't, once you're not on that schedule, you're not on that schedule. And so I did a couple features in that time. like 3, I think. None of them got made. I did a few freelances here and there, and then I went back to TV to help Ira and Renee launch 4400.
Which I love. My wife and I both love that show.
Thanks. Yeah. I worked on. I sort of was in and out of that show. I worked on the mini series, the 6-episode mini series, with Ira, and then I left to do. God, I had something else. Can't remember what the hell it was now. I think it was more work on that feature or something like that, and a couple other like pilots that didn't pan out, and then a couple pilots that did pan out, which was eventually resulted in Dresden Files. But I had 2 pilots produced during that time. One was called Scarlet, and we shot it in New Orleans, and we had to evacuate from Katrina from that one, so that was a total mess. And then it didn't get picked up, and then we did. This is Hans and I actually we did Dresden Files, and that got picked up to series. So that was sort of what I was doing, a lot of development and feature writing during that interim period. And then after Dresden Files only went for a season, I went back to 4400 for another 6 episodes to just help them with season 4. So it was a fun time. I have less credits on my resume than usual during that time, or less actually episodes written, because I was doing a lot of other stuff.
And so Dresden Files, The Gates, Alphas, Star-Crossed, Elementary. Tell me about sort of that time. Was it fairly consistent through that time, and were you more in TV and less in features?
Well, the strike was in the middle of all that. There was a strike. We were out for, I think, 100 days. That derailed some of my projects. And then I got on The Gates coming out of that, and that was like a consulting gig. I didn't know anyone in that show, but I worked with a lot of great people, Gab Stanton and Richard Haddam.
Were you on the development team?
No. I just was hired on as a consulting producer. I was available, and they needed someone to help. So I came on, did a year of that. That show didn't get renewed. And then Alphas was after that. Yeah, so that was 2 seasons of Alphas. I went back to Alphas to work with Ira again, which is, always great to work with Ira. And then there was a similar, he and Sci-Fi had some similar issues to what I had on Andromeda. But I stayed because I had a 2-year contract, and they exercised my contract. So I was basically the number 2 functionally for 2 different showrunners, both of whom were great. Ira was one, and Bruce Miller, who created Handmaid's Tale, was the other. And that was a heartbreaker when they didn't continue that show after 2 seasons. But great cast, David Strathairn and Ryan Cartwright, and just again, really good people. Great writers on the staff too. And, it just one of those things. It's television sometimes.
Yeah.
And then
totally
after that was Star-Crossed, same kind of thing, just brought on to help run the room for some show for the showrunners. They were also great. Meredith, who went on to do Haunting of Hill House, I think, and then Adele Lim, who wrote Crazy Rich Asians, or co-wrote it. And then after that, I got hired on Elementary. So it was just sort of like the TV writer's life, going from gig to gig until you land on one that lasts a while.
Yeah. Well, Elementary, you did more episodes on that than anything you've done so far, right?
Well, I think I haven't done the math. It's right up there with Deep Space Nine. I was on for 5.5 years. We did a total of 154 episodes. I think I came on around episode 39 or something like that. So I did 115, maybe 116 of that show.
Yeah.
I wrote 16 of them. I think that's right around how many I did for Deep Space Nine. It might be a few more. Yeah. I wrote a few less, or I have a few less writing credits. But they were both great gigs. I mean, those are the 2 biggest, obviously, those are the 2 biggest gigs I had in this business so far.
And you, that was also when you bumped up to executive producer on that show. And were you running the room near the end? I know Bob Goodman also was an EP on that show.
Well, I was also an executive producer on the 2nd season of Andromeda. So I finally and I was an executive producer. Yeah, I was an executive producer on Dresden Files, I feel like, too. I have to go check my credits. I think I was.
IMDb says yes.
Yes. Okay. There we go. So yeah, I got being on that show long enough. I got the EP title, Bob and I, but there were four EPs, and that show didn't really have a room.
Mm-hmm.
So that show was run in a different way entirely from everything else I'd ever done. In that most of the time you were just working by yourself or with one or two other writers coming up with stories. You'd pitch them to Rob. If Rob liked it, then you break the story, but it would just be you and Rob. So there was no room to run. Really. It was just like two or three people in a room breaking down the story. And then, yeah, so, there were four EPs, but it was Rob's show. It was always
Yeah. Well, I've heard of that too. So in that model, it tends to be higher level writers almost exclusively, right?
Yes. I mean, we did have a couple staff writers that, rose up through the ranks. But yeah, in general, we were mostly hiring our people who are already at least supervising producer a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And, as they stuck with the show, they would be co-EPs or, like Bob and I and Jason, we became EPs. Shows like that tends to be, if it's a lot of independent study and there's no room, it tends to be a lot of more experienced writers who can just do it all by themselves. So you've got four or five people who could run a room,
yeah,
and subsequently or previously had or will, and then Erica Mittman, just a lot of people who basically are qualified to be showrunners, and so they're off each sort of show running their own little episodes. It's a different structure. It works better for shows that are procedural, like Elementary, than it would for like a show with a lot of continuity or a soap or something like Starcross. There's no way you're doing like six stories an episode and you're interweaving them, and you just need a room for stuff like that. But that's how that show worked.
So how would you be a staff writer on a show like that in Rise Up? Like,
so basically, if you were a staff writer in Elementary, your job was like to just, I as a senior writer on the show would bring staff writers in to pitch them the stories that I was working on. I would have them pitch stories to me. Usually one of us would be assigned to sort of shepherd a staff writer or a lower level writer. We would do all the work supervising them up until it was time for Rob to weigh in. And you just write episodes that are useful to the showrunner. That's always the secret of being a good staff writer, or be helpful. That's it. That's the job description. Make the showrunner or the upper levels lives easier. That's it. Do that, get promoted. Keep doing it. Keep getting promoted. Hopefully be on a show that's on there long enough where you can be like Jeff King, who started out as a staff writer in Elementary and left as a co-EP after 7 seasons, which I could have done too if I'd stayed on Deep Space Nine the whole time. But I just sort of skipped supervising producer and went off and did co-EP on my own show and then EP. But yeah, that's it. It's not rocket science. It's easy in concept and difficult sometimes in execution.
So along the way, who would you say your biggest mentors were? You mentioned a couple of them.
I mean, Ira probably number one for sure. Like, I learned so much from him. Michael Pillar, I would say too, learned a lot from him. I think those are the two main ones. I certainly learned plenty from Pete Fields and Jim Crocker too. But those are sort of the upper level guys that I worked with early on in my career. And then, later on, I was out there making my own mistakes and trying to mentor other people. But I would say that those are really the biggest mentors. Not to say I didn't learn a lot from like working with Bruce Miller or Adele Lim or, Meredith Averill or Zach Penn. But I think, usually mentors are the people you work with early in your career. I mean, Jerry Taylor too. Like, I only did one episode with her of Next Generation, but she was amazing and really smart. And I think I hope I learned some good things from her too. I think that the guys on Next Generation obviously benefited from working with her much more than I did. But yeah, those are the guys I would say. Those are the people I would say had the most influence. Ira is certainly number one. I just because I did so much work with him, and then Michael Pillar too.
Yeah, and you said that in Andromeda you mentored a few and brought up a few writers. But tell me about some of the mentoring that you've done with other writers.
Well, my feeling is always that part of your job as an upper level writer is to help younger writers learn the ropes and help them grow as writers and teach them the tricks of the trade. And even on shows where I've only been on there for like a brief window of time, I still feel like that's a huge part of what my job is. I feel like just what you're supposed to do. So I think I've been helpful to a lot of young writers. And I think, continually through my career, I've always been trying to be there for people and show them the ropes and help them learn and help them become better writers. And so, even on shows like that didn't last that long, George Maestris, who worked on Breaking Bad, his first job was Dresden Files, and so we helped him get started. And Mark Bernardin was the staff writer on Alphas. Craig Sweeney came up as a staff writer on 4400, and then has subsequently he was one of my two bosses when I started on Elementary. He was Rob's number two. And like Sam Stratton, who I worked with on Starcross, just got her first show on the air, and I just worked with a lot of great young writers on Prodigal Son too. I think that there's some terrific young writers on that staff too, and I think they're going to be doing great stuff in years to come too. I think it's just about trying to, like I said, I always feel like I don't think I'll ever be able to pay the debt that I owe Michael and Ira, but I try to pay it forward as much as I can.
Very cool. We're just going to take a quick break here from sponsors, and we'll be back in a second. DrivingFootage.com provides 4K 9-angle driving plates for film and television. Over 14,000 clips are available for locations all around Southern California, with more areas coming soon. A fully equipped camera car with height-adjustable rig is available for custom shoots and second-unit photography. Visit DrivingFootage.com for details. AVGearGuide.com provides computer and gear rentals serving the LA area, including laptops with Final Draft, as low as $9 a day, with long booking rates available. They also scan photos, documents, video and audio tapes, and film reels to digital, so you can easily share with your friends and family. Mention the name of the TV Writer Podcast, and you will get 10% off your order. Visit avgearguide.com for details. Full disclosure, I do own both of these companies. By supporting them, you help me bring new in-person video interviews to you. And we're back. I do want to talk a little bit
buy
more.
whatever was just in that little break. I don't know what it was, but it sounded awesome, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so tell me a little bit more about sort of from a writer's experience, the development you've done, and you could include features in here as well. Talk about the life side of that. Like when you finish a show, you got nothing coming up. What does that development experience look like? And now some of them were properties that were brought to you, and others were on spec. Tell me about all that.
Yeah, a lot of them were actually brought to me. So a lot of it is just like you finish the project you're on, and if you've got nothing else going on, there's like two things you're going to do. One is you're probably going to write a new spec or develop a pitch of an original idea, and the other is hopefully, if you've been around for a while and you've got a good reputation, you're going to field some offers. People are going to bring you some things. Mm-hmm. In the first scenario, it's really about like following your passion and finding something that you're just super excited about working on, whether it's an established piece of IP, and I've gone out and chased IP before, or if it's something and it's an original idea, then just putting in the sweat equity to make it something that you can sell, whether that's a pitch, which is still, you got to work that up. It's a few weeks of work at least to get a pitch ready to go, get it out there, start pitching it, try to get it sold. Or a spec, just sit down and write the hell out of that thing. I've gotten so much work from specs that, never sold, or I had a couple that sold but didn't get made, but I still get a lot of work out of them, or pitches that I sold and then I was commissioned to write scripts for. So I still use a lot of those as samples, or there's a few that have never gotten made that I use as samples that I never got paid for. So it's always great to have those. You can always need samples, and and originals are better. A lot of people prefer to read originals these days. So you should always be writing something, I feel like.
Yeah.
So right now I'm working on a spec, and I have 4 different pieces of IP, one of which I chased and 3 of which are sort of, well, 2 I guess I chased, and 2 of which sort of came to me that I'm sort of bouncing around a little bit with. They're in various stages of like reality. So it's hard to know whether any of those will manifest into something. But I've done a lot of work on 2 of them.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a little tiny bit of work on one of them, and one of them I may or may not be invited to do more work on. So it's just that kind of thing. It's just like, and also there's been a bunch of projects that people have sent me that I've turned down, which is a luxury. But a lot of the time, especially if it's IP that's out there, what you're turning down is months of unpaid work. You have to find something you're passionate about. And I've been lucky to find those things. I mean, I was super excited about Dresden Files when it was brought to me. Andromeda was super exciting. Sadly, Riverworld was a super exciting project when it was brought to me. But what eventually happened to it was sort of an abortion, unfortunately. That was one of the bigger disappointments I've had in my career. That was like 2 years of my life trying to get that thing into a good place, and just to get like massively rewritten, and then the budget again slashed, and I wasn't producing it, and a lot of, I feel like, bad decisions were made in the actual production.
That sounds like the life of a feature writer.
Yeah, that was the most feature like experience I'd had, and I have a feature I'll probably write soon. If I don't get distracted by these other things. And I've written 3 books in the meantime. So one of the things I'm working on right now is just editing my 3rd novel. I just got the last round of notes. So just one last pass through it, and it should be out in July.
Very cool. Very cool.
So it's always just find things that you're passionate about. That's really what it's all about. Like, find something you're passionate about. If you're working on it, make sure you're passionate about it. Make sure you at least vaguely own it. Or at least you're attached in a significant way where you can't get messed over. Then just
we'll talk about that part too. When you say you chased IP, what does that look like?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of it, but like occasionally I'll do something like have my manager or my agent when I actually had an agent, because I don't have one right now because of the labor thing. But have my manager check into a piece of IP that I'm interested in, and just say like, hey, who owns this? Like, I would love to do something with this. A lot of times there's nothing you can do. Like, I think I was one of 80 writers they talked to about Ringworld at one point or another, and whatever, you can either, and I know I'm not that big a name. So a lot of times like they'll go after the bigger name, or someone will have a better take than you, or they're way down the line with it, or they're giving up. I mean, so I sometimes check on projects like once every 5 or 6 years just to see like, hey, that novel that I love, what the hell's going on with it? I know this company is doing something. I hadn't seen that movie yet. Is that still out there? So, I chase after that a little bit. There's a role-playing game that I love, that I actually managed to get the rights to for a year to try to sell. Haven't had much luck. But I was really excited about it. And it's not a big giant piece of IP. It's a little more obscure, and it's been a little bit hard pushing that rock up the hill. There's a bigger piece of IP that I literally just started talking to the rights holders about 2 weeks ago about. And I reached out to them. That was kind of like, hey, what's going on with this? I know you were developing it. Oh, well, it's sidetracked a little bit now because we lost the guy who was doing it, and the take isn't going to go because of this reason or that reason. I'm like, well, what if you did it this way? Oh, yeah, that sounds cool. Let's talk. So again, like, that's very early days. That could all go sideways any minute, or it could become something more serious. That's basically, there's a lot of that.
Well, it does seem like a time that having the IP makes a much bigger difference now than it might have, say, 10, 15 years ago.
I think so. I think studios and networks, IP just means a lot. Part of it is that there's so many shows out there. There's so much noise that you want something that's going to pop. And sometimes it's an established piece of IP, like The Boys, for example. Like, I'm not going to say that The Boys was a household name, but at least it gave something. It was something, right? It was a splashy, edgy graphic novel that people understood, like what it was. You can look at the graphic novel, you can understand what it could be. It's got a little bit of brand awareness out there, and you can sort of try to exploit that. And I think they did a great job. Lost in Space, I mean, having IP is not a guarantee of success, but I think in the minds of the people with the money, it does lower the risk. And I think that you can't blame someone if they're going to, throw $100 million down on the table, that they might want something that some mitigation of that risk,
Yeah.
And so I think IP is right now very important to people.
And to younger writers, make sure you actually secure it.
Correct. Make sure you secure it, or at least that the people you're working with who make sure they've secured it. I've heard people like work on things and then find out that the people they were working with didn't have the freaking rights to it,
Yeah.
So make sure that, which is crazy, but happens. So make sure that there's some legitimate chance that it will get made, and that the rights are all in pretty good shape, and that you are at least attached, very least a gentleman's agreement with somebody respectable. Ideally, that there's some contractual piece of paper. If you're the person pursuing the rights, then you get what's called a shopping agreement, and you either pay a little bit of money, or, depending on the situation, you might even be able to get it for nothing. It just depends on what the piece of IP is, but it's always better to have paper.
Yeah, definitely,
always paper.
Well, let's move on to your most recent show, which is Prodigal Son, with Chris Fedak. I love Chris. We go way back.
Yeah, Chris.
Yep. Talk about that show.
Well, this is a situation where I was sort of brought in just to help with the back nine of the first season. People are probably, your viewers are probably aware, but not everyone might be, that a lot of times when they order these shows for network, they order 13 episodes with the option to order 9 more in success, and that's called the back 9.
Yeah.
And the guys, Chris and Sam, just needed a little extra help on those back 9 episodes, and so they hired me to come in to help break story in the room and write an episode and help shepherd an episode or two. And so I came in, did that. I think I was helpful. Actually, my episode was the episode that was on stage when the COVID-19 crisis hit, and they shut production in New York. So I was like a day into production. I was in New York, and we turned the lights off, So I don't know whether that episode will ever get produced. Hopefully they'll use the script in season 2. The B stories are now all shot, because they had to skip 19 and 20.
Oh, wow.
And so they're going to go straight from 18 to 21. And they did some changes to 18 and 21 to make that work. And I think it'll work great. It's a really fun show, terrific cast. I sort of just did a special guest appearance on that show to help them out for a little bit. But it was great to do. And I love Chris and I love Sam. And they had so many great writers on that staff. But that's also like, they had a lot of great writers on that staff. They just sort of needed me to get them over that little hump.
Yeah.
And so I did that. It was fun.
Very cool. So what's next? What are you passionate about? What do you want to work on?
Well, so I wish I could be more specific. I literally have like 5 irons in the fire right now. I'm up for a couple shows. I can't name any of them, unfortunately. I'm writing a spec episode of a sort of a sci-fi genre-y pilot. That's mine. And, I'm fairly far down the road with a friend of mine in pitching a series of fantasy novels, which I can't name. I have tried to pitch a couple takes on this this paper and pencil role-playing game adaptation. Haven't had much luck, but I'm still kind of tilting that windmill a little bit. I've just started talking to this company about this other big piece of comic booky IP. I've just vaguely talked to another company about a reboot of an established property. It's all just like, they're all great. I'd love to do any of them. And I'd just, it'll be interesting to see which, if any of these things manifest. And then, that's basically it. And then pitch season, it's such a weird time. I don't know when pitch season will come around. The couple shows that I'm up for, they never even shot their pilots.
Wow.
So they were like, or they barely started shooting their pilots. So they sound like great shows. The scripts are terrific. I'd love to help. They'd be sort of in that, I'd be in that sort of, number 2, number 3, help out, run the room type of situation on either of these shows. It'd be very similar to what I did on Starcrossed. But the business is in such a weird place right now. I have no idea which of any of these things are going to manifest, so it's kind of like juggling a bunch of balls, but the balls are all ghosts. And eventually one of those balls hopefully will turn into a real thing.
Yeah.
And then you're not juggling so many things anymore,
Well,
but
it's interesting.
Like phantom juggling. Like I'm juggling a lot of imaginary objects, and then one of them will emerge from the sort of platonic cave of ideals and become a real thing, I hope.
Yeah.
And if not, then I'll just see what else people say they might be interested in me in, or what other shows are out there that need someone at my level. Yeah, it's a little crazy right now.
It's interesting. I just read an article, which will be old news by the time this podcast is released, but it was talking about how the actual studio space is booked for 18 months after this, and so there's all these pilots that were supposed to be shot. There's episodes that stopped, and everybody's going to be scrambling to try to find a way to shoot all this stuff.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really difficult to reboot the business because, especially for features, a lot of them, a lot of these features need a stage space for like a year, between prep and build and all that stuff. And they're ready to go. Like they're ready the second, if you've got a feature that was supposed to start shooting in let's say July, you've probably already secured that studio space. You own it. You're not going to want to give it back to feature that was shooting there until the middle of March and then stopped. I'm not going to give you my space. So there's going to be a lot of that. And a lot of the pilots shoot on spaces that are in disuse because the shows are down because they've finished shooting, or because the show that was there before got canceled. And so those spaces are going to go to shows that are going to say, well, we want them for 13, 22, 24, 8 at least episodes. Do you want to get a contract to that or to a pilot that's going to be there for 3 weeks and gone? So logistically, it's going to be tricky. It's going to be really tricky. Also actor contracts. It's all going to be tricky, and even renewals. I don't think Prodigal Son's been officially picked up for a second season yet. I think that it looks good for them. I certainly am rooting for them. But just a lot of logistics are going to have to get settled out when this is all done. At the end of the day, as someone once said, television and film production is basically like a giant multi-million-dollar construction job where every for 10 minutes of every hour, they put the hammers down and the actors and the pretty people come on and say words that people like me wrote. And then it goes back to being a giant effing construction job again. And so the construction job of it all is how do you make that work? It's all going to be really tricky, unfortunately. But it'll all come back. Yeah. And the only people who can work right now are writers. So hopefully something will come along where I can actually put pen to paper officially sometime soon.
It's going to be like Paranormal Activity. If somebody can figure out a way to make a TV show that is all very low-tech Skyping and that kind of thing.
It was some show that said they were going to do it that way. They were going to do it all on Skype and Zoom and stuff. What the hell show was it? One of the shows that's on the air right now was talking about doing an episode exclusively that way. I wish I could remember which one it was. It was it was a Criminal Mind. I don't know. It was some show like that where they were literally just let's see if we can do a whole episode that's based Zoom, Skype, and record actors in their homes doing cell phone stuff. I don't know. Hopefully,
bottle episodes.
I think. Look, I think as a novelty episode, I think those will be really fun. I don't think that's what people want to see every day. And there's even been a lot of discussion about how many stories people are going to want to see that are actually about this. And I think that the common logic is the answer is going to be not very many. But maybe in a few years, someone will want to do stuff about this. But I think right now, I think people are looking for some fun, little escapism, little fun,
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see. It's interesting times, as they say.
Yeah, sure is. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about help for greener writers, and that's specifically. So, say somebody who's just gotten on staff, but they don't know a whole lot yet. What would your advice be to greener writers in terms of you've talked about how even now, I mean, you're a couple decades in, and you're still constantly developing. You're constantly writing new samples and stuff. What do you think the life of a new staff writer should look like?
Well, the number one priority and the number two priority and number three priority of a new staff writer is make the showrunner's life easier. That's it. That's the job. So the first thing you need to figure out is, what does that mean? Like, what does the showrunner on this show need? Do they need someone to be in the room and write very neatly on the board? Like, sure, do that. Do they need you to take thorough notes in the room? Do they need someone to come up with ideas in the room? Do they need scenes? Do they need someone to write a bunch of outline stuff? Do they want you to just write the words that are up on the crime board in the office? Whatever they need, like, do that, research. There are shows where all staff writers do is research. I mean, The West Wing, that's all staff writers ever did. They would just write up these sort of research memos, and then eventually Sorkin would turn them into scripts. I think that's how it worked anyway. So I think that's the biggest thing that you should always lean into in a staff writer, and understand that your job is to make the showrunner's vision come true. So I think a lot of staff writers, they get hired onto a show, and I certainly didn't really understand how television worked when I got on, and I always thought, all right, they liked me and I should just do the thing I did in my feature and write some big action sequences and some fun. And it's like, we can't produce this shit. I mean, we can't do this. So one of the things I had to learn very on in Deep Space Nine was this is Michael's show, write Michael's show. What does Michael want this show to be? What does Ira want this show to be? Figure that out and write that show. Read the scripts a lot. Watch the episodes over and over again. Take notes. What are they doing? What's their style of story structure? How do they like to structure a scene? Figure that out. Study the hell out of the show. That's sort of job one. Figure out the show. Do the things that you've figured out they need. Exciting in as upbeat and as positive and as be a good soldier. That's it. That's really the first thing I would say. As far as career development, if you have time, you should still be writing specs. You should always be writing specs when you have time. Sometimes that time will be thrust upon you, but you should always have something that you're trying to noodle around that's your own stuff.
And what
but obviously the show is always a priority.
Yeah. What do you look for? Because you've been in a hiring situation a few times in submissions. What stands out in a good way? What stands out in a bad way?
I think I'm looking for someone who writes good characters and good dialogue almost before anything else. I think the next thing I'm always looking for is understanding of story structure and scene structure. Even more than story structure, someone who understands scene structure, where there's okay, is there conflict in this scene? Is it clear what each character wants? Do I understand what they're trying to do to get what they want? Do I understand why they are disagreeing or having, why is this a scene? Why is this a scene? What are we achieving in this scene? What do we go into it? And how does this scene launch us into the next scene? I don't want to just see a collection of good scenes. I want to see scenes that trigger scenes, that trigger another scene, so that every scene happens as a consequence or as a rebuttal to the scene before that. That's sort of one of the things I'm always looking for. Snappy dialogue. I don't want to read 18-page long scenes, and I don't want to read a bunch of 30-second long scenes, because this is television and we're not doing a bunch of 30-second long scenes. I want to see characters interacting with each other. I think a lot of times, there's a lot of action, and action is great, but the biggest and most powerful special effect and most expensive thing that we are going to show you on screen on television is two actors talking to each other.
Right.
Like nothing was going to be more expensive than Johnny Lee Miller and Lucy Liu in a frame together. Like those are the two most expensive assets on Elementary. Like Michael Sheen talking to a member of his family is the most expensive special effect you're going to get on Prodigal Son. And so people who are writing to that, writing characters, writing great scenes, that is what, that's what I'm looking for. Good twists, but not like, I don't know. And then if it's genre, I want someone who like fairly quickly establishes a logical set of rules that their magical universe or science fiction universe works on and sticks to those rules. Because I think that that's another thing that's really important in genre TV, especially, is like the audience has to understand why things work the way they do very quickly. And they have to be able to rely on that so they can forget about it and invest in the things that's really going to keep them coming back, which is the characters. Because it's all about character. Like at the end of the day, it's all about creating characters that the audience wants to see 8, 10, 20 times a year. Or sit down and watch 8 hours of straight these days.
Yeah.
Are they creating those kinds of characters? Because that's what I'm really looking for. Memorable characters.
So most of what people are submitting now is pilots. How important is it that they are producible? Like you said, you don't want long scenes, you don't want short scenes. So is it important that they sort of fit the flavor of the show that you're reading for?
If they're just wildly unproducible, most of the time, that also means that they just don't have a lot of character scenes in them. It's getting into sizzle, and zap, pow, explosions and all kinds of crazy stuff. And at the end of the day, what I'm looking for is always character. So I think that unproducible is usually symptomatic of a larger problem. But beyond that, I don't really care about unproducible. Like if I'm reading a show that's like set in ancient Egypt, I know that that's a huge production issue. But if the characters are cool and the scenes are great and the dialogue is great, and I know why I have a rooting interest, or at least something that's pulling me through, like that's what I care about. That's all I care about, really.
Cool. General advice, sort of what you might say to your younger self based on what you know now, or advice to somebody who is considering a career in this?
I think it's very important, and I think I've hit on it a lot, but I think it's very important to remember that television is a team sport. If you want to execute your vision exclusively and not listen to anyone, write a novel, write a play, write a feature. They'll screw you and do everything different than you, but at least you'll be able to write that feature and it will be your vision at one point. Television is really about executing the show that exists exceedingly well. So it's definitely like, you're not a golfer. You're not out there on the links with you and maybe your caddy. You're a basketball player. Your team is depending on you, and everything you're doing is about the team. It can't be about you. I mean, so I think that that's important for people to know about television. I also think, it takes a long time to get started in this business. So I would always tell young writers to be prepared to take 5 to 10 years to get that first job. Took me 5. I'm glad I stuck with it. I had some crises of faith along the way. I would tell people that if it's your passion, stick with it, but understand it's going to take some time. I wouldn't recommend anyone do it for the money. Like, it's very good money, but there are a lot easier ways to make money. Go into banking, go to Wall Street, become a lawyer. Because it's sporadic, the money sort of comes and goes. That's another thing I would tell a young writer always, is that don't spend it like that's what you're making all the rest of your life. Those first few paychecks can be kind of eye-opening. Save it. You're going to have good years and bad years. Make sure you've got enough money to get through the bad years. Those are the biggies, I think. Team sport. Don't spend all your money. Yeah.
What's your least favorite part about being a TV writer, and what's your favorite part about being a TV writer?
I mean, my least favorite part is a total lack of job security. I mean, I like to write, so I don't like these times when you're sitting around not being able to do the job, or writing on spec. That's great, but I like writing shows and getting them produced. The best part for me is working with other writers and actors and great crew and directors. That when things are clicking and the collaboration is working really, really well, and the room is humming, or the set is, churning out, banging out great stuff, and everybody's firing on all cylinders. That's just, it's thrilling. It's super fun. It's like, it's showbiz. It's like, hey kids, let's put on a show, and you're doing it, That's my favorite part. Although I do like sitting by myself in a lonely room writing, I enjoy doing that too.
Yeah.
That's hard work, and it doesn't have as much of a high, but that feeling of having written a good scene and rereading and going like, yeah, this is working. That's a great feeling too. So I would say those are my favorite things.
Very cool. I've never done this before.
The politics. The politics can suck too. I would say.
Okay. Yeah, I've never done this before, but I think this would be cool. Tell me about. I don't know if you can think of this, but the episode or the thing that you've written that you're the most proud about, like the thing that you wrote that you are really proud that you put into the universe.
Well, I will say that the thing I am the most proud about is 80 writing credits and 300 or 400 episodes of television produced. Like that by itself is what I'm the most proud of, because that speaks to a lot of things, a certain amount of professionalism, a certain amount of endurance and skill. And just that volume says something to me. Individual episodes, it's very hard for me to pick one that I'm like proudest of above all others. I feel like The Wire is probably the first episode of television where I really felt like I really knew what I was doing, and it turned out really, really well. And that was, fairly, I was fairly far along in my Deep Space Nine experience there, but I was very proud of how that episode turned out, how I came up with it, how I changed it when necessary, and how it just ended up being, I think, a pretty memorable piece of television. But I also feel like, look, Andromeda was a troubled show, but there's a couple episodes of that show that turned out great. There's an episode called Angel Dark Demon Bright I'm still very proud of. It doesn't look as good as I would have liked, but I think that the story is very compelling, and I think there's a lot of good performances from the actors, and I think it turned out really, really well. It's like trying to pick your favorite child, and I've got 400 children, that I helped raise, and at least 80 that I actually parented, I actually fathered myself, or mothered, or whatever you want to put it. And I don't. It's tough to pick just one of those. I mean, I think there's some terrific, there's some Alphas episodes I'm super proud of. There's episodes of I only wrote 2 episodes of the 4400, but I feel like I'm pretty proud of both of them. 16 Elementaries. How do you pick one of those? I mean, there's a bunch. There's one called End of Watch. I think often like the ones I'm particularly proud of are the ones where I think I finally figured out the show and like delivered an episode that like was like, not just like a learning experience, but like where I was kind of nailing the show. And End of Watch, I think, was the first one of the Elementaries that I wrote where I really felt like, okay, this is like, I know what I'm doing on this show now. And I think that's a particularly good episode of the show. It's an episode about a cop killing, and so it has a lot of heft, but it still, I think, has a really cool. The B story is pretty strong too, but I think ultimately it also just has a really strong. The mystery is good. It's just a very good mystery, and it's slightly different. The approach to the mystery is slightly different. But the reveal is kind of, I think it was clever. So there's just, too hard to choose, my friend, too hard to choose. Yeah. Also proud of my books. I'm very proud of those books. Those were more work than anything else I've ever done. Like each book is like 2 years of my life. So I'm very proud of them too.
Yeah. Well, and I must say, and I've seen a lot of more mature writers who start to write novels. The coolest thing about a novel, unlike all the collaboration of TV, is that it's all yours.
Yeah. that's the truth. The truth is, yeah, there's it's unadulterated Robert Wolfe, for better or for worse. There's no, I can't blame anyone else for the things that don't work, and no one else gets credit for the things that do work. I don't know how many novels I'll manage to write in the time I have left on the face of the earth. They're a tremendous amount of work. But I'm glad I did the 3 that I did, and I'm proud of them.
Very cool. Well, I think we'll end it here, but really thank you for taking all this time. Can people follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Writer Geek RHW is my Twitter handle. I'm there dispensing questionable wisdom all the time. So if people have questions about the business, I'm always happy to answer them. Yeah, so that's the easiest way for people to interact with me is Twitter.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much, Robert. Really appreciate you being on here.
Happy to do it. Have a good one. Stay safe.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Robert Hewitt Wolfe. There's lots more coming. Hoping to release these every week for the foreseeable future. And in order to help me do that, please do check out tvwriterpodcast.com/support to find out how you can become a patron of the podcast for as little as 25 cents per episode. And as well, do check out the podcast site for lots of other resources like free scripts and a Twitter database of over 1,000 writers. And also, I do want to urge you to subscribe on YouTube, on Podbean, on iTunes, Spotify, all those places. Post your comments, reviews. Follow me on Twitter, @GrayJones is my handle, and you can share your thoughts there. Questions for upcoming writers. You can find out who's going to be interviewed by following me on Twitter and connecting with me there. Also, if you're a writer and you want to be interviewed on the podcast, absolutely reach out to me. @GrayJones is my handle. Anyway, have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.